Are interprovincial relationships proving to be collateral damage on the Prime Minister's pre-budget tour? Over the past week, the feds have rolled out a series of announcements about what's going to be in the budget, many with a common theme. They're putting up money for issues that fall under provincial jurisdiction and want provinces to accept a laundry list, of conditions to access cash. As you heard in that clip, the Prime Minister doesn't seem too interested in negotiating, saying he'll leapfrog over premiers and go right to Canada's mayors if he needs to. So how might all of this play out politically? Let's bring in the front bench with us this evening. Former British Columbia Premier Christy Clark. She's now a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. CTV News political analyst and former Toronto Mayor John Tory is here, as is David Coletto, the founder, chair, and CEO of Abacus Data. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Before we get into the political back and forth, David, I'll start with you because you've done so much great granular work about what issues matter to Canadians and why that has informed the popularity or lack thereof for various political parties. How significant is the issue of housing and a lack of affordability to Canadians right now?
Yeah, hi, Vassy. Most of those issues are, I think, in the top two. Housing, more than half of Canadians say it's one of their top three issues. The broader cost of living, 3 and 4 put it in their top three. So all eyes are on this. Most people are talking about it. When we ask them what's keeping them up at night, it's either the price of things, housing, or the general cost of living. And so it is probably the most important issue facing most people. And as a result, politicians need to respond.
And we saw last summer, Christy, the Prime Minister said, oh, you know what, this is primarily provincial jurisdiction. He got a lot of flack for saying that, and ever since, has made a series of announcements. But this week has been primarily making announcements about money that would flow through provinces, but they would have to agree to a number of conditions like introducing a renter's bill of rights or freezing development fees in order to qualify for that money. We heard some of the pushback already. How much of a fight do you think it will be?
Well, Vassy, can I take you back 150 years to 1867 when they wrote the Constitution? And the reason they structured it the way that they did is because they recognized Canada is a huge and very diverse country, can't all be governed from Ottawa. They came up with the separation of powers, which is very clear, and things like housing and healthcare and dental care and childcare and all of those things are in provincial jurisdiction. And there's a good reason for that, because you can't run that stuff from Ottawa. And provinces then went to municipalities and said, you're going to have some responsibilities too that are sort of separate from ours, but there's a little more control. But the point is that the federal government at some point, and I think it was, kind of the Chrétien-Martin government, decided that they got tired of just paying for stuff and they weren't getting any credit for it. This is an example of the federal government trying to find a way to get credit for something that they don't actually have any responsibility for delivering. They don't care really as much about what gets done as about whether or not they get credit for what seems to be getting done in the country. It's a terrible way to run Canada. It's totally contrary to the way this country was originally imagined. And it's too bad because it is actually making it harder to get things done. What you see, for example, when there are thousands and thousands of people employed in municipal and provincial governments responsible for housing across the country, the federal government's growing by 30%. Why? Because they're trying to do all these other people's jobs all over again.
Here's the only sort of political caveat I would add to that, John, is if I recall David's polling, which I've looked at pretty closely, especially over the last 8 months, when the Prime Minister made those remarks saying, it's not really our jurisdiction, and he got a lot of flack for it, and the criticism really started to mount that the federal government was not responding to affordability challenges more largely, including housing. That's when his poll numbers really started to go down, and when the Liberals' poll numbers really started to go down. My guess is they think there's a political imperative. I take Christy's point, obviously, about the merits of it, but my guess is they really have determined there's a political imperative for them to appear as active as possible.
I think David's polling might bear me out on this. There's probably a higher percentage of people who think they have a proper role to play in helping with housing because it's a big problem. They want all hands on deck than are voting for the Liberal Party at the moment. So there's only upside, I think. Well, there's also some downside. And I don't mean this to be critical of my friend Christy, but she's speaking as a former premier. I'm speaking as a former mayor of the biggest city in the country. We had meetings for years and pleaded with the federal government to come back into the housing field. And the notion that they should just hand over money and just say, here, you take it, there's a history to that too. And by the way, I don't think most people out there in the country could care less about the Constitution 150 years ago. That's the problem. It was written 150 years ago, and we're in 2024. And I think that the people want all hands on deck on the housing. I think they would think it is reasonable, as long as the conditions are reasonable, that the federal government shouldn't just hand over money. I mean, if these things then are the responsibility solely of the provinces, because that's what the Constitution says, then the federal government should stop paying for health care and stop paying for housing. But everybody pleads with them to be in it. Years ago, the other precedent was that they gave up tax points to the provinces, who then had that money available to them and then said they didn't have enough. And so I'm just saying, I think we cannot have it all ways in this country if we're going to get stuff done. And the conditions, yes, have to be reasonable, but the notion they should just hand over unconditional money and no end to it at all, I think people wouldn't accept that either. They want some accountability, and they want to be able to prove that actually, yes, some things are getting done in return for the federal participation, which mayors at least, and I think premiers, pleaded for.
But Vassy, this is the point is that things aren't
yeah,
getting done.
go ahead, and then I'll get David back.
And the reason things aren't getting done is because the federal government literally cannot build housing all across the country by itself, or even think that it's going to be a meaningful partner in anything but funding it. Absolutely, the federal government should be there funding stuff, just like they fund roads. But boy, provinces build the roads, and provinces figure out where they're going to go, and they do the consultation with neighborhoods. I mean, it's crazy to think that there's 30% more bureaucrats in Ottawa trying to figure out, well, okay, sorry, neighborhood, you don't want fourplexes, but we're going to build them here anyway. I just think, if it worked, okay, maybe it would work, but there's absolutely no evidence that has worked for this government in Canada, or for any government in Canada. And I think Premier Doug Ford is absolutely right about that.
Well, this is a government, and
yeah,
sorry,
okay.
Vassy, but this is
important.
important.
John, but I got to
I know you do, and this is important because in the end, I don't think it's fair to say that the federal government should have this role to play just to hand over money unconditionally. Who holds them to account? I mean, the people do, and say, you handed over all this money, and where's the housing? And so on. And so, look, I agree that the provinces should have principal responsibility. In fact, I believe even more strongly that cities should have most of the responsibility, because that's really local. But at the end of the day, the notion that the federal government should write checks till the cows come home for all these things and then have nothing to say about it, and nothing to say about whether there's any results actually produced or whether the money's even spent on what they send it for, I think is not acceptable to Canadians either.
David, from what you see, where are Canadians' heads at when it comes to this? Do they look at the different jurisdictions? Are they holding provinces versus the federal government to different levels of responsibility? Who is wearing this issue?
Yeah, well, we did a survey back at the end of last year, and we asked people, how satisfied are you with each level of government when it comes to housing? And on all three levels, people said, no matter where they were in the country, they were dissatisfied with the federal, provincial, and municipal governments. They think all three are failing on this issue. That's how critical it is. But interestingly, when we ask which one do you blame the most, or do you think has done the worst job, the feds actually wear more of it, which is, I think, the political problem that the Prime Minister and the Liberal government finds itself in, that if it done nothing, if it literally continued to say, this is not our responsibility, we're not going to do anything here, call Mr. Ford, call Mr. Eby, and let them solve this problem. Guess what? All the critics from the different parties would be out saying, Mr. Prime Minister, you haven't done anything. So I think what voters want, what Canadians want, is to see their leaders actively engaging on the issues they want to see action on. And politically, I don't think there's anything the government could do. I think they have to use the purse and the power that they have, whether it's constitutional, whether it's their jurisdiction. That's for political scientists like me to argue about. I don't think they're arguing about that at their kitchen table.
That's right.
Can I ask the bigger strategic question, Christy? Wait, I just want to ask you, this is all part and parcel of the federal government announcing everything that's going to be in the budget, trying to land sort of a changing of the channel with Canadians who have been largely critical of their performance on the affordability file. Do you think any of this changes the channel for them in the longer run?
Well, I don't think so, because the problem is they're not getting it done. And I mean, David's point is right. It's all politics. This whole thing is just about how do they benefit politically when, I think the concern for public officials should really not just be political gain, which I completely understand. I used to be in politics. It should actually also be about delivering things with public money. And when you see the federal government growing by thousands and thousands of people, I mean, it's a third bigger, doubling up on responsibilities that are already being done by thousands and thousands and thousands of bureaucrats in provinces and municipalities across the country. That's where you see the appetite for political gain, which is, I know what David measures, coming hard up against the appetite for actually getting something done. They will not benefit from any of this concern that they have unless they actually can do it, and they can't do it. They are too far away as a practical matter. Absolutely, they have a responsibility to write checks. Absolutely, they should get some credit for that. But to actually think that they can set the rules and decide what happens in Enderby, BC, all the way from Ottawa, is just a ridiculous dream and probably a free lunch for a bunch of civil servants who get jobs.
Vassy, Toronto isn't as far away from Ottawa as BC, I'll admit. But you know, I will say this, when they had their rapid housing program and they told us if they would give us the money to build supportive housing for people with illness and dependency issues and so on, and we had to have it built and occupied in 12 months and buy it or do modular housing, we did it because we wanted to get the money and we wanted to build that supportive housing, and the housing stands there with people living in it today because they put that condition on. And I think people who argue against this would say, well, they have no business setting those conditions. I was glad they did. It sped us up in what we did too. And so I think, again, it has to be reasonable. But I mean, to me, to just hand over the money, I just don't think that it doesn't get them any credit because no one knows. And it just doesn't achieve anything in terms of getting houses built, which is what people want.
But that is how they built
30
the country
seconds
for 250
left.
years, right? I mean, that is what they've done since Canada was founded for 150 years. Since Canada was founded, the federal government has been writing checks for provinces to build roads and hospitals and schools, and cities to build, you know, other things. That's what we have done. This is always the way that we've done it, and it's worked.
150 years ago.
Except not in housing. I mean, the only thing I would say is except not in housing right now, right? That's the issue. Very quickly, David, I just wanted to get a 30-second answer from you. How baked in is sentiment among Canadians right now on affordability and the Liberals? Do you think this effort will make a difference?
Well, I think every story needs a hero and a villain. And what I think the Liberals have tried to do over the last week on the carbon tax, on housing, on other things is start to engage the premiers as that villain into why a lot of these problems are happening. And we'll see if it works. But I think, you know, the poll numbers can't really get much worse for Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals right now. And so they're swinging for the fences and hoping that that ball gets over that outfield wall.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Spicy today. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Christy Clark, John Tory, and David Coletto. Great discussion. Thanks, everyone. Have a